The air in the room possesses immeasurable, oppressive weight. It is the fragile, colorless hour just before dawn, a time when the ambient temperature seems to draw warmth directly from the marrow of the bones. The sharp, mechanical rhythm of a ticking wall clock slices through the silence, each second landing like a tiny hammer against the eardrums. A figure sits at the edge of a mattress, shoulders curved inward, a chest hollowed in the posture of someone bracing for an impact that has not yet arrived. The alarm has just severed the temporary sanctuary of sleep, plunging the nervous system immediately into a dense, familiar static. For this individual, the simple act of existing requires immense, calculated force. Every movement through the morning routine is laced with friction. The water from the faucet feels abrasive. The fabric of the clothing feels restrictive. The very act of walking to the train station is a battle against an invisible headwind. They step out into a crowded, damp street, their mind already wrestling with the ghosts of afternoon meetings, defensive emails, and the looming anxiety of financial survival. The world presents itself as an obstacle course of closed doors, locked gates, and competitors hoarding scarce resources. To live, in this universe, is to push a boulder up a jagged incline, knowing the moment the hands slip, it will all come crashing down. Yet, operating within the exact same physical coordinates, breathing the exact same oxygen, and walking the exact same rain-slicked pavement, a completely different universe unfolds for someone else. Watch this second figure move through the crowd. There is no frantic urgency in their stride, yet they arrive precisely on time. The dense, chaotic energy of the morning commute seems to part around them like water flowing gracefully around a smoothed riverstone. When a train is delayed, their jaw does not clench. Instead, their gaze drifts to a billboard, sparking a sudden, brilliant idea for a project they had been stuck on for weeks. A stranger bumps their shoulder, spilling coffee, and rather than a confrontation, it leads to a shared laugh and an unexpected, highly lucrative professional introduction. They do not appear to be pushing reality. They appear to be carried by it. Problems that would entirely paralyze the first individual simply dissolve upon contact with the second. The locked doors swing open just as they reach for the handle. The right opportunity, the exact amount of funding, the perfect creative collaborator all materialize with an ease that borders on the mathematical. It is as if they are tethered to a deep subterranean ocean current, pulling them effortlessly toward their destination, while everyone else exhausts themselves paddling wildly at the turbulent surface. These two individuals share the same zip code, the same economy, and the same morning hour, yet they are participating in two entirely different dimensions of existence. Faced with the stark, unsettling contrast between these two lives, the human psyche reflexively builds a fortress of rationalization. To witness another person gliding effortlessly through a reality that feels entirely hostile to one's own survival is deeply destabilizing. To protect the ego from this cognitive dissonance, the mind weaves a tangled forest of assumptions, planting thick, thorny vines of justification to explain away the anomaly of ease. Why do people default to the belief that the universe is playing favorites? The answer lies in the terrifying responsibility of absolute power. If the effortless reality of the second individual is not the result of blind luck, nepotism, or a secret formula guarded by a shadowy elite, then the uncomfortable truth remains. The friction of the first individual's life is self-generated. It is far easier for the mind to construct a myth of gatekeepers to believe that success, love, and peace are precious commodities hoarded behind velvet ropes by the fortunate few. To believe in gatekeepers is to surrender agency. It provides the comforting, though melancholic, blanket of victimhood. If the system is rigged, one does not have to take responsibility for the frequency they are broadcasting. But how does this illusion of a hostile, restricted universe sustain itself so convincingly in the physical body? It is entirely biological, carved into the neurological pathways of the human animal over millennia. A thought rooted in scarcity, the belief that one must fight to survive fires across the synaptic gaps of the brain. This electrical spark triggers a chemical cascade, flooding the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. The nervous system shifts into a defensive posture, dilating the pupils to scan exclusively for threats. In this contracted, survival-based state, the brain literally filters out peripheral possibilities. The neurological receptors become completely blind to serendipity. The individual cannot see the open window because their biology is violently fixated on the locked door. The belief in external gatekeepers acts as a self-fulfilling prophecy. When a consciousness vibrates at the dense, heavy frequency of struggle, it treats reality like a solid wall, and in response, reality solidifies. The person caught in this loop is not fundamentally unlucky, nor are they broken. They are simply operating a vastly powerful biological and energetic machine precisely in reverse. They are transmitting a frequency of desperate friction into the quantum field, and the field, operating in perfect, unbiased obedience, returns a reality that demands to be fought. To observe the mechanics of this shift, one must trace the quiet history of an architect named Elias, who spent the better part of a year trapped in a self-constructed cage of intellectual friction. Elias was tasked with designing the central atrium of a sprawling metropolitan healing center, a space meant to evoke serenity and natural flow. For 9 months, the project had been a theater of war. His drafting studio was heavy with the physical residue of struggle. Stacks of tracing paper were violently crumpled in the corners. The graphite on his desk was ground down to brittle, sharp points. Every evening, he left the studio with a dull, throbbing ache at the base of his skull, his nervous system buzzing with the static of impending failure. He tried to force the design into existence, staying awake until 3 in the morning, consuming acidic coffee, demanding that his intellect conquer the architectural problem. He believed that if he just suffered enough, if he just applied enough sheer, agonizing force, the solution would eventually surrender. The universe, in turn, mirrored his frantic resistance. Permits were inexplicably delayed. Suppliers went bankrupt. The design remained hollow, sterile, and stubbornly lifeless. Then came an anomalous Tuesday in late October. There was no grand epiphany the night before, no triumphant breakthrough, but when Elias opened his eyes that morning, the gravitational pull of the room had fundamentally altered. The cold, leaden dread that usually pinned him to the mattress was entirely absent. The temperature of the air felt softer, carrying a crisp, clean stillness. He breathed in, and for the first time in months, the oxygen seemed to reach the very bottom of his lungs, uncoiling the tight, tangled roots in his chest. He walked into his studio, but he did not sit at the drafting table with his usual posture of attack. He simply stood by the window, watching the steam rise from a cup of tea, observing the way the morning light caught the dust motes in the air. His mind was entirely devoid of the frantic, chattering calculations that usually consumed him. The internal radio of anxiety had been turned to a station of absolute silence. Without thinking, moving purely on a gentle, somatic impulse, Elias picked up a piece of charcoal. He did not try to solve the atrium. He simply allowed his hand to trace a sweeping, asymmetrical curve across a blank sheet of vellum. He drew another line intersecting it, mimicking the organic arch of a tree canopy he had just seen outside. In less than 14 minutes, the entire structural flow of the space revealed itself. It was not a violent conquest of geometry. It was an elegant, simple solution that had always been present, waiting patiently beneath the noise of his previous struggle. 10 minutes after he set the charcoal down, the phone rang. It was a structural engineer calling to apologize for missing an earlier meeting, casually mentioning a new, lightweight composite material that would perfectly support the exact curved canopy Elias had just drawn. The struggle of 9 months dissolved in the space of a single morning. The locks turned. The current caught him. What occurred in the silent hours between Elias's frantic Monday and his miraculous Tuesday, the physical laws of the universe, did not suddenly reorganize to accommodate an exhausted architect. The external reality of the city, the deadlines, and the engineering constraints remained entirely unchanged. What shifted was the receiver. The tuning fork of his consciousness temporarily ceased its abrasive, fearful vibration. By dropping the resistance, by relinquishing the desperate need to force an outcome, Elias allowed his nervous system to relax. In that space of deep somatic release, his frequency elevated, lifting him out of the dense underbrush of survival mode and into the vast, open canopy of the unseen field. He crossed a threshold of perception where the solution, which had always existed in the energetic matrix, finally became visible to his conscious mind. This rare morning of alignment is not a random gift bestowed by a fickle universe. It is a glimpse into the natural state of human existence when the artificial friction of fear is removed. It is the invisible current revealing itself. To embody this truth requires no immediate, monumental action. It demands only the quiet courage of observation. The task is to step into the day and simply notice the places where the body braces for impact. Notice the tightening of the throat when an email arrives. Notice the subtle clenching of the jaw while waiting in traffic. Observe the deeply ingrained habit of expecting reality to be difficult. Do not attempt to fix the friction. Merely bear witness to the heavy armor the psyche insists on wearing. Recognizing the weight of the armor is the necessary precursor to setting it down. Yet, recognizing this need for a higher frequency often leads the eager mind into a deeply treacherous terrain. The realization that one's internal state dictates outward reality sends many plunging headfirst into a modern psychological hazard, a well-intentioned but suffocating ideology that demands eternal sunshine. The instinct is to artificially manufacture the alignment Elias felt, to paint a vibrant smile over a rusting, agonizing foundation. This desperate attempt to hack the universe through sheer, forced optimism creates a paradox so destructive, it traps individuals in a lower frequency than ever before. A gilded cage awaits those who misunderstand the mechanics of vibration. The architecture of that very specific, exhausting trap must be dismantled next. The fluorescent light above the bathroom mirror emits a low, mechanical hum, casting a harsh, sterile glare across the porcelain sink. The air in the small room is entirely devoid of movement, stale with the scent of mint toothpaste and exhaustion. Standing before the glass is a figure caught in a silent, violent internal war. The hands gripping the edge of the counter are white-knuckled, the tendons pulled taut beneath the skin, betraying a desperate need for an anchor. Look closely at the reflection. The eyes, rimmed with the pink exhaustion of unshed tears and chronic insomnia, carry a heavy, drowning sorrow. Yet, the muscles of the face are performing an agonizing choreography. The corners of the mouth are pulled upward into a rigid, trembling smile. The jaw is locked tight. Through clenched teeth, a whisper breaks the silence. I am abundant. I am full of joy. I welcome only light. The words land in the room like stones dropped onto a hollow wooden floor. There is no resonance, no truth in the vibration. The air feels thicker, stickier. Beneath the sternum, an entirely different reality is screaming to be acknowledged. A dense, heavy grief perhaps, from a fractured relationship, a professional failure, or a deep, nameless loneliness is sitting heavy in the chest, demanding oxygen. But the mind, gripped by the terror of attracting further suffering, acts as a ruthless sentry. It forcibly shoves the grief down into the dark, tangled forests of the subconscious, plastering a frantic, artificial sunshine over the jagged wounds. This is the hidden agony of the modern seeker. In the desperate pursuit of a higher frequency, they have weaponized their own mindset against their biology. The act of forcing gratitude over genuine, bleeding pain requires a monumental expenditure of physiological energy. The nervous system becomes a frayed wire, sparking erratically as it tries to reconcile the deep somatic truth of sorrow with the cognitive mandate to feel entirely blissful. It is a posture of profound exhaustion, a soul carrying a boulder while performing a flawless, smiling waltz for an invisible audience. The body aches under the unbearable weight of this mandatory optimism, trembling in the space between what is truly felt and what is desperately performed. To untangle this suffocating web, the mind must ask a dangerous question. Why has the pursuit of a higher vibration mutated into such a clinical, exhausting performance? The answer is rooted in a fundamental misinterpretation of how the universe interacts with human consciousness. The ego, desperate for control over an unpredictable reality, seizes upon the concept of manifestation and distorts it into a transactional law. If a positive thought produces a positive outcome, then a negative thought must summon an immediate catastrophe. Driven by this deep-seated terror of the dark, the individual begins to police their own internal landscape with authoritarian brutality. The shadow self is banished. The natural, messy weather patterns of the human experience are classified as dangerous anomalies to be instantly neutralized by manic affirmations. But how does this relentless pursuit of positivity paradoxically lower the body's energetic state to the densest possible frequencies? It occurs through the biological and energetic mechanics of resistance. Emotion is, at its core, energy in motion. When sadness, anger, or fear arises, it requires a specific neurological and somatic pathway to express, process, and release itself. When the cognitive mind intercepts that natural flow, when it slams the door shut and forces a smiling mask over a weeping nervous system, the energy does not simply vanish, it becomes trapped. The unexpressed emotion calcifies within the cellular memory, creating dense, stagnant blockages in the body's subtle architecture. Furthermore, an insidious secondary layer is instantly generated. Shame. The individual feels a wave of natural depression, and immediately, the inner critic attacks. You are ruining your vibration. You are attracting poverty. You are failing to be spiritual. Now, the original sorrow is buried under a heavy, toxic blanket of guilt and self-judgment. The biological system enters a state of internal civil war. The brain floods the body with stress hormones, not because of the external environment, but because the mind is actively attacking the heart for daring to bleed. This internal friction is the precise mechanism that plummets a person's frequency. The universe does not respond to the words spoken in the mirror, it responds to the actual, resonant frequency of the organism. When a person forces a smile while their nervous system is suffocating in suppressed fear, the frequency being broadcast into the quantum field is not joy. The frequency being broadcast is desperation, denial, and a profound, exhausting resistance to what is real. The universe simply mirrors back the resistance, delivering more circumstances that require the individual to fight against their own reality. The positive thinking trap is revealed not as a ladder to ascension, but as a locked, airtight room slowly running out of oxygen. To witness the breaking of this illusion, one must look at Maya, a woman who had spent 5 years treating her own psyche like a volatile, dangerous prisoner. Maya had curated a life of flawless aesthetic spirituality. Her apartment smelled of sage, her journals were filled with relentless declarations of peace, her vocabulary was surgically scrubbed of any word that carried a low vibration. Yet, a deep, silent rot was spreading through the floorboards of her life. Her business was slowly asphyxiating, and her body was plagued by chronic, unexplainable fatigue. She treated her exhaustion as an enemy, fighting it with aggressive meditation and louder, more desperate affirmations. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in late January, on a desolate, jagged stretch of the northern coastline. Maya had driven out to the ocean to force herself back into alignment, determined to shout her affirmations into the wind until the heaviness dissolved. She stood at the edge of the cliffs. The sky was the color of bruised iron. The wind did not gently caress the shoreline. It howled, carrying a freezing, abrasive mist that stung her cheeks. Below her, the ocean was engaged in a violent, chaotic upheaval. Massive waves, black and foaming with white crests, slammed into the granite rocks with the force of a detonating charge, sending explosive towers of freezing water into the air. Maya stood trembling, her jaw clenched, trying to visualize golden light, trying to whisper her mantras of absolute serenity. But the ocean roared over her fragile, forced words. It offered no warmth, no comfort, no sunshine. It was entirely unapologetic in its destruction. In that freezing, chaotic moment, a realization pierced through Maya's carefully constructed armor, sharp and clean as a surgical blade. The ocean was not failing to be positive. The ocean was not terrified that its violent storm would ruin its frequency. It simply allowed the storm to exist, knowing with profound, ancient certainty that the tide would eventually pull back, the winds would eventually die, and the water would return to glass. The earth does not apologize for the death of winter. The forest does not force the leaves to remain green in the snow. It draws its energy deep into the roots, resting in the dark, trusting the cyclical rhythm of existence. Maya's knees buckled against the wet stone. For the first time in 5 years, she stopped trying to force the summer. She dropped the affirmations. She opened her mouth and allowed a primal, ragged sob to tear through her throat, releasing a torrent of grief over a life that had felt so incredibly hard to maintain. She wept until her lungs burned, surrendering entirely to her own internal winter. And in that profound surrender, in the total acceptance of her own darkness, the strangest biological phenomenon occurred. The chronic tension at the base of her skull dissolved. The heavy, suffocating band across her chest cracked open. By fully accepting her lowest emotional state, Maya's actual energetic frequency experienced a massive, spontaneous elevation. She was no longer at war with reality. She was finally, deeply breathing. The path out of the positive thinking trap requires no new mantras, no vision boards, and no exhausting mental gymnastics. It requires only the quiet, radical courage to drop the mask. The invitation is to sit in the stillness of a room and allow the face to rest exactly as it wants to rest. If there is grief, let the eyes carry the grief. If there is anger, let the heat rise in the chest without immediately rushing to douse it with the cold water of rationalization. True high frequency is not found in the manic curation of only light. It is found in the expansion of consciousness to hold both the light and the dark simultaneously, without judgment, without panic, and without resistance. When an individual stops treating their natural emotional weather as a spiritual failure, the internal civil war ends. The trapped energy is allowed to move, to burn, to wash through the neurological pathways and exit the body, leaving behind a clean, spacious emptiness. Yet, as the heavy, forced armor of toxic positivity falls away, it leaves the senses naked and exposed to an environment that is far stranger and more complex than ordinary perception allows. With the internal noise finally silenced, the mind begins to notice the subtle, bizarre anomalies in the fabric of the physical world. The stillness reveals that the space around the body is not empty at all. The air itself seems to hum with a hidden architecture, vibrating just beyond the edge of human sight. The realization begins to dawn that the eyes, the ears, and the hands are only capturing a microscopic fraction of what is actually in the room. The true nature of reality is not solid, and the mechanism that governs it is waiting in the unseen depths. Look closely at an empty room bathed in the stillness of mid-afternoon. A single beam of sunlight slices through the space, illuminating thousands of microscopic dust motes suspended in the air, swirling in a slow, silent dance. The thermostat on the wall registers a comfortable 70 degrees. The silence feels absolute, heavy enough to ring slightly in the ears. To the ordinary human senses, the room is vacant, quiet, and entirely static. The brain, processing the sensory input from the eyes, ears, and skin, confidently declares the environment to be empty. This declaration is a profound, biological illusion. Beneath the threshold of human perception, that empty room is a raging, chaotic ocean of energy and information, flowing through the very space where the dust motes drift and passing directly through the flesh, bone, and cellular structure of anyone sitting in that room are hundreds of thousands of invisible frequencies. There are radio waves carrying the heavy bass of a symphony playing 3 towns over. There are cellular signals transmitting millions of frantic text messages, photographs, and financial transactions. There is ultraviolet light, infrared radiation, and the faint, ancient cosmic microwave background humming from the birth of the universe. The human eye is only biologically equipped to perceive roughly 0.0035% of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The human ear can only capture a microscopic sliver of acoustic frequencies. The nervous system is effectively locked inside a dark, silent vault, peering out through a tiny keyhole and arrogant enough to believe that whatever is visible through that crack constitutes the entirety of existence. To understand the mechanics of reality, one must deeply internalize this terrifying and liberating truth. The vast majority of what exists is entirely invisible. The solutions, the opportunities, The sudden serendipitous encounters, they do not exist in some distant, mystical future. They exist right here, right now, occupying the exact same physical space as the heavy, quiet room. They are simply vibrating at a frequency that the biological hardware of the human animal is currently unable to detect. The individual is not waiting for the universe to create a miracle. They are standing in the middle of a torrential downpour of potential, holding a thimble, blindfolded, wondering why they are so thirsty. Faced with this teeming, invisible matrix of information, a vital question emerges from the depths of the psyche. Why does the biological organism filter out so much of reality, and how does it decide which tiny fraction of the universe to make visible? The answer lies in the heavy, tangled forest of human survival programming. The brain is an extraordinarily expensive organ, consuming massive amounts of the body's metabolic energy. To conserve resources, it cannot process the billions of bits of data flooding the senses every second. It must act as a ruthless editor, stripping away everything that does not immediately align with the organism's most pressing mandate. And what dictates that mandate? The predominant emotional and psychological state of the individual. Think of human consciousness as an intricate, biological tuning fork. Every thought, every deeply held belief, and every suppressed emotion carries a specific, measurable electrical charge. When an individual is gripped by the cold, restrictive fear of scarcity, the belief that the world is hostile, that time is running out, that failure is imminent, their nervous system begins to vibrate at a dense, heavy frequency. The biology responds immediately. Cortisol floods the bloodstream, the muscles brace for impact, and the reticular activating system in the brain stem physically narrows the field of perception. In this low-frequency state of survival, the tuning fork is vibrating in the key of threat. Consequently, the brain will only edit in reality that matches that frequency. The individual will walk down a street and notice only the scowling faces, the closed businesses, and the impending rain. They will read an email and perceive only criticism. The universe is not punishing them. Their own biological receiver is simply dialed to a station that exclusively broadcasts struggle. How, then, do the miracles remain hidden? When the tuning fork vibrates with fear, it cannot simultaneously resonate with the frequency of expansion. A solution to a complex career problem might literally be spoken by a stranger sitting at the next table in a coffee shop. The sound waves will enter the ear canal of the person trapped in scarcity, the eardrum will vibrate, the auditory nerve will fire, but the brain will instantly discard the information as irrelevant noise. The opportunity is deleted from conscious awareness before the individual ever knows it existed. They are completely blind to the open doors because their internal frequency mandates that only locked doors are real. The universe is a mirror of vast, oceanic potential, but it will only reflect the exact wavelength of the light that is shone upon it. Long before the cold, mathematical instruments of modern quantum physics could measure these hidden bandwidths of reality, there were quiet, radical observers who mapped this architecture through the sheer force of human awareness. In the heavy, industrialized thrum of 1920s, New York, a world obsessed with smokestacks, steel girders, and the undeniable solidity of matter, a woman named Florence Scovel Shinn sat in a quiet parlor, observing the invisible currents dictating human lives. She did not view the world through the lens of a mystic seeking escape, but rather as an architect studying the underlying blueprints of existence. She watched the wealthy elites and the destitute masses, noting a startling pattern. The material circumstances of their lives were not the cause of their internal states. The material circumstances were the delayed, physical echoes of their dominant internal frequencies. She documented a phenomenon she termed the collective unconscious, not as a vague, poetic concept, but as a literal, living matrix of patterns. She understood that every human mind is plugged into an invisible web, an ocean of potential where every possible outcome is simultaneously suspended in a state of grace, waiting to be anchored into reality by the correct vibration. Consider a historical case from her private records. A woman arrived at Florence's door in a state of absolute, crushing panic. The woman was destitute, facing immediate eviction, her nervous system completely hijacked by the terror of poverty. Every word she spoke was a frantic declaration of lack. She was desperately searching the physical world for money, pounding on the locked doors of reality, exhausting her biology in the process. Florence did not hand her a check, nor did she offer hollow, positive affirmations. She understood that giving resources to a mind vibrating at the frequency of lack would be like pouring water through a sieve. Instead, she guided the woman to fundamentally alter her internal tuning fork. She forced the woman to sit in the stillness, to slow the frantic breathing, and to systematically withdraw her energy from the illusion of the hostile, empty room. She taught her to strike a new note to generate the somatic, bodily feeling of already being entirely provided for, despite the terrifying evidence of the physical senses. For 3 days, the woman practiced holding this new, unnatural frequency. It was agonizing work, requiring her to build new neurological pathways while the old tangled roots of fear screamed for attention. But she held the note. She tuned the dial. On the 4th day, the woman walked down a street she had walked 100 times before. But this time, her receiver was tuned differently. She bumped into an old acquaintance she had previously overlooked. A brief conversation ensued. An offhand remark was made, and a massive, unexpected financial avenue swung wide open. The acquaintance had been walking that same street for months. The capital had always been there. The potential outcome had been floating in the quantum field the entire time. The woman did not magically create the money out of thin air. She simply elevated her frequency until she became visible to a reality that was already waiting for her. The implications of this invisible architecture dismantle everything the modern mind has been taught about ambition, struggle, and the pursuit of a meaningful life. The deeply ingrained belief that one must fiercely conquer the external world is revealed as a tragic misunderstanding of physics. The dream, the solution, the profound love, the financial liberation. None of these things require a desperate, bleeding climb up a jagged mountain. They do not exist in a distant, heavily guarded fortress. They are right here. They are in the quiet room. They are in the air moving through the lungs. They are swimming in the ocean of potential, vibrating at a frequency that is simply a few degrees higher than the heavy static of daily anxiety. To step into this new paradigm is to stop treating the external world as the source of reality and to recognize it merely as the printout of the internal state. The physical world is entirely secondary. The only task that matters, the only genuine work of a human life, is the meticulous calibration of the internal receiver. When the blinders of survival mode are gently removed, the dense fog of the 5% reality lifts, revealing a sprawling, breathtaking landscape of synchronicity. But to navigate this newly revealed landscape, one cannot simply guess where the dial is pointed. The human emotional spectrum is vast, complex, and deeply deceptive. A person can easily believe they are vibrating at the frequency of peace when, in truth, they are drowning in suppressed apathy. To master the tuning fork, one requires a precise, scientific instrument, a map that charts the exact energetic weight of every human emotion. The transition from blind stumbling to conscious creation requires a journey into the very cartography of the soul, seeking the exact coordinates where survival ends and true, limitless power begins. There is a specific density to the atmosphere in a room where hope has been fully extinguished. The light filtering through the window panes does not warm the floorboards. It seems to pool like stagnant, gray water, heavy and devoid of vitality. The air itself feels thick, carrying the oppressive, crushing pressure found at the very bottom of deep oceanic trenches where light has never penetrated and the cold is absolute. To breathe in this space requires a monumental, conscious exertion of the diaphragm. The lungs resist expanding, as if taking in oxygen is an act of unwarranted arrogance. A body inhabiting this frequency does not stand upright. It collapses inward, the shoulders rounding in a biological imperative to protect the vital organs from an environment perceived as entirely lethal. This is the physiological architecture of apathy, guilt, and profound shame. In these dense, subterranean emotional states, the individual is not merely feeling sad. They are undergoing a cellular shutdown. The nervous system, battered by chronic defeat or unbearable trauma, has bypassed the frantic fight-or-flight response and plunged directly into a state of freeze. The gaze becomes locked, staring at a patch of peeling paint on the wall, yet registering nothing. The ticking of a nearby clock slows down, each metallic click echoing like a gavel striking a block of solid ice. In this state, the concept of a brighter future is not just unbelievable, it is deeply offensive to the neurological pathways fighting simply to survive the next 10 seconds. To a consciousness vibrating at the frequency of shame, the universe is not an ocean of infinite potential. It is a locked, windowless cell, and the individual holds the absolute, unshakable conviction that they alone threw away the key. They are trapped in a tangled forest where the canopy is so thick, the very memory of the sun feels like a cruel hallucination. Faced with such profound, paralyzing density, a critical inquiry must be made. Why does an emotion possess the power to literally blind the physical eyes to opportunity, and how does one navigate out of a space where the compass itself seems broken? To answer this requires abandoning the romantic, poetic view of emotions as mysterious weather patterns and adopting the clinical precision of a cartographer. The late psychiatrist and researcher Dr. David Hawkins spent decades mapping this invisible terrain, creating a logarithmic scale of human consciousness. In this paradigm, emotions are not random, chaotic events happening to a person. They are exact, mathematical coordinates. They are the precise mile markers on the highway of the soul, indicating the exact frequency at which a biological organism is currently vibrating. Why is it biologically impossible to simply think one's way out of the lowest frequencies? Because at the bottom of the scale, shame, guilt, apathy, grief, and fear, the organism is operating exclusively from the primal, reptilian centers of the brain. The amygdala is flooded with threat signals. When consciousness anchors at these coordinates, the lens of perception severely contracts. A person vibrating at the level of fear, calibrated at 100 on Hawkins' scale, looks out into the world and sees a terrifying landscape of predators and threats. The universe is perceived as punitive. If an extraordinary business opportunity or a deeply loving partner were to appear directly in their field of vision, the brain would instantly distort the data, labeling the opportunity as a scam and the partner as a manipulator. The biological receiver simply cannot process frequencies that exist above its current station. How, then, does the map function to alter reality? It functions by revealing that moving up the scale requires passing through specific, sequential gates of energy. One cannot leap from the paralyzing gravity of apathy directly to the weightless euphoria of peace. The journey upward requires the transmutation of energy. To move from apathy to grief requires tears. To move from grief to fear requires recognizing a threat. To move from fear to anger requires the birth of desire, a sudden, desperate need for things to be different. Anger, while often vilified, is actually a higher frequency than apathy, because anger contains movement, it contains the heat of life. But there is a single, definitive threshold on this map that alters the entire trajectory of a human destiny. Below this line, life happens to the individual. They are the victim, the casualty, the passive recipient of an unforgiving universe. To cross this line is to break the gravitational pull of the lower dimensions entirely. That threshold, calibrated at the exact tipping point of human empowerment, is courage. To witness the crossing of this threshold, observe the silent turning point in the life of a man named Julian. For 3 years, Julian had been trapped in the dense, suffocating gravity of a collapsed venture. A business he had built from nothing had imploded violently, taking his life savings and his closest friendships with it. For 36 months, Julian operated below the threshold of courage. His daily existence was a masterclass in the lower frequencies. He marinated in guilt over the investors who lost capital. He sank into apathy, letting unopened envelopes pile up on the kitchen counter like a monument to his failure. His posture was perpetually braced for the next catastrophe. Whenever a new idea flickered in his mind, the heavy, wet blanket of fear extinguished it instantly. "Do not try again," his nervous system whispered. "Survival means staying small. Survival means staying invisible." The shift did not happen on a mountaintop, nor did it arrive with a triumphant surge of adrenaline. It happened on a dreary Thursday afternoon, seated at the edge of his unmade bed, staring at the stack of final collection notices. Something deep within his biological architecture, a tiny, exhausted spark of defiance finally snapped. It was not a roar, it was a profound, quiet exhale. Julian realized the effort of constantly defending himself against his own failure was actually more agonizing than the failure itself. In a single, imperceptible moment, he made a conscious choice to stop running. He reached out, picked up the thickest envelope, and slid his finger under the seal. This was the mile marker of courage. Courage is not the absence of terror, it is the willingness to observe the terror without blinking. The moment Julian opened the letter, a massive neurological shift occurred. The amygdala, realizing the human was no longer fleeing, began to quiet down. Blood flow surged back into the prefrontal cortex, the center of logic, creativity, and executive function. His pupils dilated, the heavy, gray filter over his vision dissolved. He looked at the debt not as a reflection of his soul's worthlessness, but merely as a mathematical problem requiring a solution. By crossing into courage, Julian shifted his internal tuning fork from reactive to creative. He was no longer a victim of the letters, he was an active participant in reality, evaluating data. That very evening, operating from this elevated frequency, his newly activated prefrontal cortex synthesized a connection between two seemingly unrelated industries he had worked in. A solution presented itself with such striking clarity, he laughed aloud in the empty room. The opportunity had been sitting in the quantum field for 3 years, waiting patiently for Julian to vibrate at a high enough frequency to finally perceive it. This map of consciousness is not merely a philosophical theory, it is the literal blueprint of human existence. Every interaction, every financial decision, every romantic entanglement is governed entirely by the emotional coordinate from which the individual is operating. The realization of this truth strips away all excuses, but in doing so, it returns absolute, terrifying, and beautiful sovereignty to the individual. To embody this truth today requires an act of radical and passionate honesty. It asks for a quiet pause in the frantic rush of daily life to check the internal GPS. Where does the nervous system currently reside? Is it anchored in the defensive posture of anger? Is it hiding in the dark, tangled roots of apathy? Or is it standing at the precipice of courage, ready to look the illusion of failure directly in the eye? There is no judgment to be found on this map. A mile marker is not a moral failing, it is simply a statement of location. To ascend, one must first be entirely honest about where they are standing. If the resonance of these words strikes a chord deep within the architecture of the mind, if the map being unfolded here brings a sudden, quiet clarity to a lifetime of invisible struggle, then consider leaving a trace of that recognition. Engaging with this journey, subscribing to this channel, leaving a comment of resonance, pressing the like button acts as a powerful beacon in the digital expanse. It is not merely an algorithmic transaction. It is a declaration of presence. It signals to the collective field that there is a hunger for profound truth over hollow comfort. Every subscription, every shared reflection, helps this specific frequency find its way to others who are still wandering in the heavy air of the lower dimensions, desperate for a map out of the dark. The choice to engage is a choice to amplify the signal of awakening for the entire collective. When that signal is amplified, when the threshold of courage is firmly crossed, and the frequency continues to climb into acceptance and reason, the very fabric of the surrounding world begins to alter its behavior. The rules of physics, once thought to be solid and unforgiving, begin to bend. The chair, the room, the locked doors, they lose their density. As consciousness elevates, the individual prepares to step through the looking glass, leaving the mechanical world behind and entering a domain where solid matter is revealed to be the greatest, most convincing illusion ever orchestrated. The quantum field awaits. Rest a hand against the solid, reassuring grain of a heavy oak chair. Press the fingertips into the varnished wood. The sensory feedback is immediate and undeniable. The wood is cool, rigid, and entirely dense. When a tired body lowers into this chair, the skeletal structure surrenders its weight to gravity, trusting implicitly in the absolute solidity of the physical object beneath it. The human nervous system is deeply anchored in this Newtonian reality, deriving a profound sense of safety from the belief that matter is fixed, stable, and fundamentally separate from the mind observing it. Yet, to look through the lens of quantum physics is to watch this comforting illusion entirely disintegrate. If one were to zoom in microscopically past the polished surface of the wood, past the tightly bound cellular walls of the oak, past the complex molecular chains of carbon and hydrogen, the illusion of solidity violently collapses. At the subatomic level, there is no solid wood. There is only a dizzying, chaotic storm of subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons darting frantically through vast, incomprehensible expanses of empty space. If the nucleus of a single atom in that chair were the size of a marble sitting in the center of a massive football stadium, the electrons would be microscopic gnats buzzing in the highest, furthest bleachers. Everything in between is a dark, echoing void. The chair is 99.9999% empty space. Furthermore, the physical hand resting upon it is composed of the exact same emptiness. The sensation of touch, the comforting feeling of resting upon a solid object, is a biological hallucination. The electrons in the atoms of the human hand are simply repelling the electrons in the atoms of the chair with such violent electromagnetic force that the brain interprets the repulsion as a solid boundary. The flesh never actually touches the wood. It hovers, suspended in a magnetic tension, interpreting an energetic frequency as physical reality. To sit in a quiet room and truly internalize this reality is to experience a profound perceptual vertigo. The walls, the floorboards, the heavy burdens of financial debt, the seemingly immovable barriers of a stagnant career, all of it is composed of this exact same vibrating emptiness. The world is not a fixed, rigid structure built of impenetrable stone. It is a kinetic, shimmering ocean of energy and information, temporarily holding its shape based purely on the frequency of the observer interacting with it. When the foundation of solid matter is pulled away, the psyche is left staring into a vast, unanchored abyss. Confronted with the truth that the physical world is merely a dense concentration of vibrating energy, a rigorous, recursive line of inquiry must immediately follow. Why does the human psyche so fiercely defend the illusion of a solid, unyielding world, even when that world is a source of immense suffering? The ego, an evolutionary mechanism designed purely for physical survival in a dangerous environment, requires fixed boundaries to navigate existence. If reality is fluid, the ego cannot predict threats. To maintain control, the brain's neurological filter acts as an aggressive censor. It takes the infinite, undulating waves of quantum potential and collapses them into a single, static picture that matches the individual's core beliefs. The human mind defends the solidity of its problems because a known nightmare feels biologically safer than an unknown miracle. If a person believes their life is a heavy, inescapable cage, their consciousness acts as a dense gravitational field, literally forcing the surrounding quantum energy to arrange itself into the shape of iron bars. But how does a mere shift in internal emotion physically alter this external hologram? The answer lies in the observer effect, a cornerstone of quantum mechanics which dictates that a particle exists in a state of pure potential, a wave of infinite possibilities until it is observed, at which point it collapses into a single, fixed point of matter. Human consciousness is the ultimate observer. It is the projector casting light through the film of belief onto the screen of reality. When an individual elevates their frequency moving from the heavy, suffocating density of fear into the expansive, oxygen-rich environment of courage and acceptance, they are changing the lens on the projector. They are no longer observing reality through the bandwidth of scarcity. As the frequency of the observer rises, the quantum field must logically and mathematically respond. The heavy, seemingly immovable obstacles in life begin to dissolve back into pure energy, reorganizing themselves to match the newly elevated vibration. Paths that were completely invisible at the frequency of fear suddenly crystallize into matter. The individual is not forcing the world to change. They are simply accessing a higher dimension of the hologram that was previously out of their perceptual range. To witness this quantum collapse in motion, one must observe the exact moment an identical physical event fractures into two entirely different universes. Consider the sudden, catastrophic collapse of a global supply chain, an event that decimated a highly specialized manufacturing sector overnight. Inside the same glass-paneled boardroom, two executives, Arthur and Silas, received the exact same data. The shipping routes were permanently frozen, the raw materials were unreachable, the company's primary product could no longer be built. The physical facts in the room were identical. Arthur's reaction was immediate and biologically violent. His nervous system interpreted the data as a lethal threat. His frequency plummeted instantly into the dense, paralyzing depths of fear and apathy. His breathing grew shallow, his pupils dilated to scan for danger, and the prefrontal cortex of his brain effectively shut down. Vibrating at the frequency of sheer survival, Arthur collapsed the quantum field around him into a reality of pure ruin. He looked at the idle factories and saw a wasteland. He looked at the severed contracts and saw the end of his career. Because his receiver was tuned exclusively to the frequency of disaster, every subsequent decision he made over the next 6 months, the frantic liquidation, the defensive lawsuits, the bitter severing of relationships only solidified the iron bars of the cage. He experienced a reality of total destruction. Across the same boardroom table sat Silas. Silas felt the same initial shockwave of adrenaline, the same sudden drop in the stomach. But Silas had spent years meticulously cultivating the capacity to observe his own biological reactions. As the panic rose in his chest, he did not fuse with it. He took a long, slow breath, creating a microscopic gap between the external event and his internal state. He consciously anchored his frequency in the steady, expansive space of acceptance. The product cannot be built. The old path is dead. By holding this elevated frequency, Silas did not collapse the field into ruin. He kept the wave of possibilities open. Operating from a calm, expansive neurological state, his brain was able to process peripheral data that Arthur's panicked mind had aggressively filtered out. Silas looked at the same idle factories and did not see a graveyard. He saw millions of square feet of highly sterile, climate-controlled space. He looked at the severed supply chains and realized the sudden absence of the old product created a massive, immediate vacuum in a completely different, emerging industry that required domestic, sterile assembly. Within a week, Silas was retrofitting the dead factories to assemble components for a new, highly lucrative renewable energy grid. He hired back the workforce Arthur had panicked and fired. Arthur and Silas did not experience different realities because they had different luck. They experienced different realities because they were tuned to different bandwidths of the exact same quantum field. Arthur observed a solid wall and crashed into it. Silas observed vibrating energy and walked entirely through it. The realization that the physical world is a flexible, highly responsive projection fundamentally reorders the human experience. It strips away the illusion of absolute victimhood and replaces it with the profound responsibility of the observer. The unyielding brick walls of daily life, the stubborn conflicts, the immovable debts, the stagnant routines are not permanent fixtures of the earth. They are dense clusters of information, patiently waiting for a new set of eyes to look upon them and command them to dissolve. To embody this truth is to practice the art of the soft gaze. When confronted with an intimidating obstacle today, the invitation is to pause and look directly at it without immediately assigning it the weight of permanence. Feel the urge of the mind to declare the situation hopeless, rigid, and solid. Then, breathe slowly into the belly, reminding the nervous system that the problem is merely a temporary arrangement of energy. By refusing to panic, by refusing to lower the internal frequency to match the heavy vibration of the obstacle, the observer starves the problem of the dense energy it needs to maintain its shape. The lock on the door begins to rust and turn to dust. Yet, understanding the holographic nature of the universe is only half the equation. The quantum field is infinitely responsive, but it is not responding to abstract, intellectual thoughts. It is responding directly to the visceral, biological frequencies generated by the human body. The observer effect is not a mystical spell cast by a floating spirit, it is a mechanical process driven by the wet, firing synapses of the human brain and the chemical cascades of the nervous system. To truly master the reality occurring outside the body, one must first master the intricate, microscopic wilderness occurring within it. The transition from philosophical understanding to physical transformation requires descending into the dark, tangled forest of human neurology. The thoughts and emotions currently projecting the reality of the observer are not just abstract concepts, they are physical, biological structures carved into the brain. To change the universe, one must first physically rewire the hardware of the mind. Venture into the microscopic, silent wilderness inside the human skull. It is an environment of absolute darkness, devoid of light, sound, or temperature, yet it crackles with an unrelenting, electric vitality. This is not a static organ, it is a sprawling, densely woven jungle of 86 billion neurons, a living, breathing metropolis of biological circuitry. Observe the birth of a single, habitual thought. A flash of insecurity triggered by a passing glance from a stranger. The moment the visual data is processed, an electrical impulse violently ignites. It surges down the long, slender axon of a neuron, moving at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. As it reaches the precipice of the synaptic cleft, the microscopic chasm between cells, the electrical charge triggers a cascade of chemical neurotransmitters. These molecules leap across the void, docking into the receptors of the adjacent neuron, passing the message forward. Danger. Rejection. I am not safe. This is not an abstract, ethereal event. It is a physical, biological action. Every time this specific sequence of fear fires, the brain's architecture responds by reinforcing the pathway. Myelin, a fatty, insulating sheath, wraps itself thicker and tighter around the axon, upgrading the connection from a fragile dirt path to a highly efficient, high-speed neural superhighway. The next time a similar trigger occurs, the electrical impulse will not hesitate. It will automatically blast down this insulated highway, completely bypassing the slower, deliberate centers of logic and reason. The thought of unworthiness is no longer just a passing psychological cloud. It has become a hardened, physical structure within the brain. The individual is not merely experiencing an emotion. They have physically constructed a biological prison, and the bars are forged from their own reinforced neural pathways. The mind is a machine perfectly designed to optimize whatever pattern it is fed, blindly sculpting the flesh to ensure that the heavy, dense reality of fear is the only reality the organism can ever easily access. Confronted with this relentless biological machinery, a critical inquiry surfaces. Why does the brain prioritize the construction of these dark, defensive pathways so aggressively, and how does this internal wiring dictate the external reality of the organism? The answer is buried deep within the evolutionary mandate of survival. The brain is not designed to make a human being happy, fulfilled, or spiritually aligned. It is designed, with ruthless efficiency, to keep the biological organism alive until sunset. To the primitive centers of the human brain, a negative, fearful thought is perceived as a protective mechanism. It is safer, biologically speaking, to assume every rustling bush contains a predator. Therefore, the brain heavily biases and accelerates the wiring of negative experiences, a phenomenon known as the negativity bias. The ego, functioning as the chief security officer of the organism, acts as a hostile architect, aggressively demanding the construction of thick, impenetrable neural walls to defend against an unpredictable universe. But how does this neurological architecture bridge the gap to physical reality? The mechanism is found in the breathtaking science of epigenetics. The old materialist paradigm dictated that human beings were at the absolute mercy of their genetic code, that DNA was a fixed, unalterable destiny. Epigenetics shatters this illusion, revealing that while the genetic blueprint is fixed, the expression of those genes is entirely fluid, dictated by the environment of the cell. And the primary factor shaping that cellular environment is the chemical cocktail produced by the brain in response to the individual's thoughts. When a person engages in the habitual firing of the neural superhighways of fear, anger, or resentment, the hypothalamus triggers the release of stress hormones, cortisol, and adrenaline flooding the bloodstream. The cells of the body, bathed in this toxic, highly acidic environment, respond by upregulating genes associated with inflammation, disease, and cellular breakdown. The body is literally bracing for an attack that exists nowhere but in the mind. Conversely, when an individual consciously interrupts that automated pathway and fires a thought anchored in gratitude, courage, or deep peace, a completely different chemical cascade occurs. Dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin flood the system. In this alkaline, oxygen-rich cellular environment, the exact same DNA responds by downregulating the genes for disease and upregulating the genes responsible for repair, vitality, and longevity. The individual is not merely thinking differently. They are actively, physically rewriting their biological hardware in real time. They are the composer of an epigenetic symphony, dictating which genes are silenced and which are amplified, purely through the frequency of their conscious focus. The hologram of the external world reorganizes itself, because the observer has fundamentally altered the biological instrument used to project it. To observe the sheer physical brutals required to break a neural superhighway, one must look at the silent, brutal struggle of an artist named Clara. For 20 years, Clara had operated under the paralyzing belief that her creative voice was profoundly irrelevant. This was not a mild insecurity. It was a heavily myelinated, high-speed neural pathway that dictated her entire existence. Every time she sat before a blank canvas, the old circuit fired. You have nothing new to say. This is a waste of time. The electrical charge would blast down the familiar route, triggering a flood of cortisol that physically constricted her chest, numbed her fingers, and filled the room with a suffocating, heavy density. For 2 decades, Clara would predictably surrender to the biological chemical dump, put down the brush, and retreat into the dense frequency of apathy. Her intellectual understanding of this pattern was flawless. She had read the texts on neuroplasticity. She knew the theory of the quantum field. Yet, her reality remained stagnant, because knowledge, without the physical disruption of the automated reflex, is entirely useless. The reprogramming began on a rainy Tuesday. Clara sat before the canvas, and precisely on cue, the old neural circuit fired. The familiar, sickening wave of cortisol hit her bloodstream. The urge to flee was violently biological, but this time, Clara did not stand up. She remained seated. She gripped the edges of the wooden stool, her knuckles white. She closed her eyes and deliberately engaged the prefrontal cortex, the slow, deliberate, conscious center of the brain. She forced herself to take a deep, slow breath, intentionally counteracting the rapid, shallow breathing dictated by her survival brain. She did not try to forcefully paint a masterpiece. She did not scream hollow affirmations. She simply sat in the discomfort and refused to let the old electrical impulse complete its habitual route. She observed the thought, "This is a waste of time," and met it with a quiet, devastatingly neutral response. That is merely a heavily myelinated pathway firing. It is not the truth. By refusing to react, by starving the old pathway of its usual emotional payoff, Clara forced her brain to do something extraordinary. The electrical charge, denied its high-speed route, had to forge a new path through the dense, uncharted wilderness of the brain. She picked up the brush, her hand trembling violently against the chemical protest of her body, and placed a single stroke of cobalt blue on the canvas. In that microscopic moment, a new dendritic connection was formed. A fragile, tiny dirt path was carved in the jungle. It was exhausting. It required more energy than running a marathon. But the next day she did it again. And the next. With every conscious interruption, the old superhighway began to wither and prune away from lack of use, while the new pathway of creative agency grew thicker, insulated, and faster. Clara did not just change her mind. She physically dismantled a cage inside her skull and built an entirely new architecture of freedom. The realization that the mind is a physical laboratory, and not an ethereal cloud, fundamentally changes the approach to human suffering. The recurring nightmares of daily life, the sudden flashes of rage, the paralyzing grips of anxiety, the deeply ingrained habits of self-sabotage are stripped of their mystical power. They are revealed to be nothing more than heavily worn grooves on a biological record, playing the same song because the needle has never been consciously lifted. To begin the work of reprogramming today requires stepping into the role of the biological architect. The instruction is simple in theory, yet monumental in execution. Intercept the automation. The next time the familiar, heavy wave of frustration rises, perhaps in response to a delayed flight, a sharp comment, or a financial setback, do not immediately follow the old, well-lit superhighwave reaction. Pause. Feel the physical sensation of the cortisol hitting the bloodstream. Acknowledge the intense, bodily urge to react defensively. And then, hold the line. Take one deep breath, deliberately widening the gap between the trigger and the response. In that single quiet breath, a new neural pathway is born. The old architecture begins to starve. Yet, a profound and unsettling paradox emerges in the quiet space created by this conscious interception. If the thoughts are just electrical impulses traveling down biological wires, and the emotions are just chemical cascades dictated by those wires, who is the one doing the intercepting? If the brain is merely a highly advanced, programmable piece of hardware, and the mind is the software running upon it, who is the programmer? The search for the true center of human agency requires stepping out of the biological machine entirely. It requires confronting the ultimate, dizzying question of identity, seeking the invisible, silent witness that watches the thoughts fire but is not the thoughts themselves. The journey moves beyond the brain, toward the vast, uncharted territory of the observer. The room is entirely submerged in the quiet, heavy velvet of midnight. A solitary desk lamp casts a stark, circular pool of white light across the wood grain, leaving the surrounding corners dissolved in shadow. Sitting within that harsh circle of illumination is a figure entirely consumed by the physical inferno of anger. The body is rigid, the skeletal structure locked into a defensive posture. Heat radiates from the chest, flushing the skin, while the jaw muscles bulge beneath the surface, clenching with enough force to grind enamel into dust. A bitter memory, replaying on a relentless, automated loop in the mind, floods the bloodstream with acidic spikes of adrenaline. The nervous system is a tangled forest of live wires, sparking with a violent, intoxicating sense of righteous injustice. The human animal, in this precise state, believes entirely that it is the anger. The fusion between the emotion and the identity is absolute, seamless, and entirely unexamined. But then, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurs in the atmospheric pressure of the room. The breathing, previously shallow and ragged, catches for a fraction of a second. In that microscopic pause, a new, entirely different dimension of consciousness flickers into existence. It is a quiet, vast, and terrifyingly silent presence that suddenly steps back from the burning physical sensation. A question arises, not from the frantic, chattering intellect, but from the deep, still waters beneath it. If this intense, burning anger is being watched, who is the one watching it? The paradox cracks the foundation of the ego wide open. There is the heavy, suffocating sensation of rage tightening the throat. And simultaneously, there is the silent, untouchable awareness, noticing the throat tightening. The camera of consciousness has suddenly pulled back, revealing that the subject and the object cannot be the same entity. The eye cannot see itself. The scale cannot weigh itself. Therefore, the entity observing the anger cannot fundamentally be the anger. In the span of a single heartbeat, the illusion of absolute fusion shatters. The figure at the desk realizes they are not the raging inferno, they are the vast, cool, infinite space in which the fire is temporarily burning. Confronted with the sudden realization that the mind is merely a screen upon which temporary emotional weather is projected, a rigorous, recursive deconstruction must begin. Why does the human psyche so desperately fuse its identity with these fleeting chemical cascades? The ego is an architect of boundaries. It is terrified of the infinite, the formless, and the unknown. To the survival-driven brain, absolute emptiness feels exactly like death. To prevent this dissolution into the void, the ego constructs a rigid, heavily defended fortress of identity out of whatever materials are readily available. Most often, the easiest materials to source are the jagged stones of past wounds, chronic anxieties, and deep-seated grievances. The mind would rather endure the heavy, suffocating density of chronic pain than face the weightless, undefined terror of being purely a silent witness. A defined wound offers a defined border. It provides a shape, a narrative, and a predictable and controlled environment. But how is this fusion maintained so convincingly? The mechanism of this entrapment relies entirely on the architecture of human language. An examination of written narrative content titled Chapter 1, The Contract of the Breath, explores the deep relationship between language, perception, and personal identity. The exploration of identity concepts and the spoken phrase I am reveals how easily the ego binds itself to temporary states. When a dense emotion moves through the biological pathways, the intellect rushes in and dictates the phrase, I am sad, or I am angry. This is the ultimate contract of identity. The moment the vocal cords or the internal monologue vibrate with the words I am, the consciousness is biologically and energetically glued to the passing emotion. The temporary weather pattern is suddenly claimed as a permanent structural feature of the soul. The entanglement becomes absolute. To break this contract requires a profound psychological severing. It demands the radical discipline of linguistic and somatic disentanglement. The consciousness must learn to observe the heavy, dark tide rolling in and refuse to sign the contract. The internal dialogue must shift from the fused state of I am experiencing terror to the liberated, observational state of terror is currently moving through this physical biology. This slight linguistic shift changes the entire electromagnetic frequency of the brain. The observer steps out of the tangled, burning forest of the ego and takes a seat on the silent ridge above, watching the fire burn without ever catching flame. To fully grasp the magnitude of this disentanglement, one must look upward, away from the dense earth, and observe the violent mechanics of a high-altitude tempest. Imagine the sensory violence of a Category 5 storm raging across a darkened coastline. Down at the surface, the reality is pure chaos. The wind howls with a deafening, abrasive shriek, tearing leaves from branches and hurling debris through the black air. The rain does not fall, it fires sideways like frozen shrapnel. Lightning violently fractures the sky, followed by a concussive shockwave of thunder that rattles the very marrow of the bones. To a creature standing on the ground, trapped within the vortex, the storm is the absolute totality of existence. It feels permanent, all-encompassing, and lethal. The world is nothing but water, wind, and destruction. Now, imagine an aircraft pulling its nose upward, pointing directly into the heart of the thunderhead. The metal frame shudders violently. The cabin is plunged into darkness, battered by hail, tossed mercilessly by invisible, violent updrafts. The struggle is terrifying, heavy, and intensely physical. But then, the aircraft pierces the final, dense layer of the cloud canopy. In a fraction of a second, the violence ceases entirely. The aircraft breaches the stratosphere. Here, there is no wind. There is no rain. The air is exceptionally thin, perfectly still, and crystalline in its clarity. Above, the stars burn with a steady, unblinking brilliance against the infinite, silent blackness of space. Below, the massive, bruised anvil of the storm continues to rage, flashing with internal lightning, rolling and churning in a desperate frenzy. The storm is still happening. The violence is still real. But up here, in the vast, untouchable expanse of the stratosphere, it becomes glaringly obvious that the storm is merely a temporary event passing through the sky. The sky itself is completely unharmed. The sky is never wet from the rain, it is never burned by the lightning, it is never torn by the wind. It simply provides the infinite space for the weather to occur, to exhaust its energy, and to eventually dissolve. The human ego is the creature screaming on the ground, entirely convinced it is the storm. The true consciousness, the silent witness, is the stratosphere. When the observer's paradox is fully realized, the individual does not stop the emotional weather from occurring. They simply realize they are the boundless, untouchable space in which the weather is passing. Resting in the stratosphere of the mind brings a profound, almost alien peace to the biological organism. The constant, exhausting necessity to defend the ego, to control the narrative, and to fight the surrounding quantum field evaporates. The individual becomes a master of their own frequency, not by suppressing the dark, heavy emotions, but by simply refusing to become them. The practical embodiment of this truth requires daily, microscopic acts of rebellion against the automatic programming of the brain. When an unexpected rejection arrives, when a financial terror grips the stomach, when a harsh word causes the chest to instantly tighten, the mandate is clear. Do not immediately react. Let the chemical cascade of cortisol flood the bloodstream. Let the heart rate accelerate. Let the biological machine do exactly what it has been programmed to do. But step back. Find the silent space. Watch the physical sensation rise and fall, exactly as one would watch a dark cloud roll across a mountain peak. The mastery of this observer state neutralizes the friction of existence, allowing the invisible current to finally carry the organism forward. Yet, an intellectual understanding of the sky is fragile. When the lightning strikes entirely too close, when a trauma activates the deepest, most primal survival circuits of the nervous system, the sheer biological force of the reaction often yanks the consciousness straight out of the stratosphere and violently back into the mud. The mind forgets it is the sky and plummets back into the terrifying belief that it is the storm. To maintain the elevated frequency of the observer during moments of profound, physical turbulence, a different kind of alchemy is required. A method must be found to transmute the heaviest, darkest emotional energy without losing the silent seat of awareness. The journey must now move from the ethereal realm of observation down into the dense, cellular reality of the physical body. The transition from absolute tranquility to biological terror can occur in the space of a single, echoing heartbeat. Imagine a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The sunlight is painting long, lazy geometric shapes across the hardwood floor. A cup of coffee rests on a ceramic coaster, a thin wisp of steam curling into the still air. And then, the sharp, electronic vibration of a telephone shatters the silence. The screen illuminates, displaying a name, an email subject line, or a bank alert. The eyes scan the text, and in a fraction of a millisecond, the physical environment undergoes a violent, imperceptible distortion. The ambient temperature of the room seems to plummet, leaving the skin suddenly cold and damp. The walls, previously distant and benign, appear to lean inward, compressing the available oxygen. The auditory field narrows dramatically. The hum of the refrigerator fades into a high-pitched, internal ringing. Inside the body, an ancient, ruthless machinery roars to life. The amygdala, perceiving an existential threat, floods the bloodstream with a heavy, acidic cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol. The heart begins to hammer against the ribcage, like a trapped bird. Blood is violently shunted away from the digestive tract and the prefrontal cortex, rushing directly into the heavy musculature of the arms and legs. The human animal is bracing for a physical impact, preparing to fight a predator or flee into the tangled forest. Except, there is no predator. There is only a piece of digital information. In this agonizing moment, all previous spiritual training, all intellectual understanding of quantum fields and observer states, threatens to vaporize. The heavy, gravitational pull of survival programming demands absolute compliance. The mind screams for action, for a frantic defensive email, for a distraction, for a physical escape, or for the total, numbing collapse of denial. The urge to resist the incoming wave of terror is overpowering. The ego stands at the gates of the nervous system, brandishing the weapons of panic, fully convinced that if it allows this dark, heavy wave of emotion to actually enter the body, the organism will be entirely annihilated. When the biological alarm bells are ringing at deafening volumes, a rigorous inquiry into the mechanics of suffering must be mounted. Why does the human system instinctively fight the arrival of a dark emotion with such visceral aggression? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of what an emotion actually is. The ego, functioning as a terrified sentry, perceives fear, grief, or anger as invading armies. It believes that to feel the despair is to become the despair. If the dark emotion is allowed to cross the threshold, the ego assumes the house will burn to the ground. Therefore, the mind deploys massive reserves of neurological energy to build a dam against the incoming wave. It suppresses, it rationalizes, it argues, and it distracts. But how does this resistance actually anchor the individual into the lowest possible frequency? It occurs through the physics of friction. Emotion is a thermodynamic event. It is energy in motion. Like a river rushing down a mountainside, it has a natural, temporary lifespan. If a river is allowed to flow unimpeded, it will eventually empty into the sea and return to stillness. But when the mind builds a dam of resistance, it halts the natural flow of energy. The dark emotion pools, deepens, and stagnates. The pressure builds exponentially. The nervous system becomes trapped in a state of chronic, low-grade electrocution, forever attempting to hold back a wave that simply wanted to wash through and exit. The true anchor that pulls the frequency downward is not the initial fear. It is the exhausting, relentless war waged against the fear. To dismantle this dam, a quantum leap in internal syntax is required. The language the mind uses to narrate the storm dictates the biological reality of the storm. When the mind declares, "I am ruined," "I am terrified," "I am failing," it signs a linguistic contract of fusion. The vast, infinite observer collapses itself into the tiny, localized experience of the terrified biological vehicle. The alchemy begins with a microscopic shift in language, transitioning from the heavy anchor of identity to the spacious realm of observation. The internal narrative must pivot. There is a profound sensation of terror moving through this chest. The heart rate is highly elevated. A wave of grief has arrived in the physical biology. This is not a semantic game. It is a neurological hacking of the threat response system. By speaking of the emotion as a temporary guest arriving in the physical space, rather than an identity consuming the soul, the prefrontal cortex remains online. The observer steps back, creating a sliver of space between the awareness and the burning sensation. In that tiny, quiet gap, the alchemy of acceptance becomes possible. To witness this alchemy in motion, observe the silent crucible of a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor had dedicated 12 years of her life to a singular, defining pursuit, a nonprofit organization she had built from the ground up to protect endangered coastal ecosystems. It was her identity, her livelihood, and her deepest passion. On a Tuesday morning, a coordinated legal and financial maneuver by a hostile corporate entity successfully stripped the organization from her control. In a single hour, her life's work was legally erased. Eleanor stood in the center of her living room, a legal document trembling in her hand. The biological storm that hit her was catastrophic. The cortisol wave was so dense it physically drove her to her knees. Her chest seized, her throat closed. The internal monologue began its frantic, automated scream, "My life is over, everything is gone, I am entirely destroyed." Her first instinct, ingrained through decades of survival programming, was to fight the feeling. Her mind scrambled to find a distraction, an anger to hide behind, a frantic legal strategy to plot, or simply a glass of wine to dull the blinding, white-hot pain in her solar plexus. The dam was being built out of sheer panic, but Eleanor, breathing in short, jagged gasps on the hardwood floor, made a radical, terrifying choice. She remembered the mechanics of the wave. She lay on her back, staring up at the blank ceiling. She closed her eyes and deliberately ceased all resistance. She imagined the front door of her mind, and instead of barricading it against the invading terror, she walked over and swung it wide open. She extended an invitation to the darkness. "Come in," she signaled to her own nervous system. "Burn as hot as you need to burn. Take up as much space as you require. I will not fight you." The moment she dropped the resistance, the fear surged forward with terrifying velocity. For several minutes, the physical sensation was agonizing. Her body shook uncontrollably. The grief washed over her in heavy, suffocating waves, dragging her down into the deep, lightless trenches of her own biology. But Eleanor did not fuse with it. She remained the silent, observing sky, watching the Category 5 hurricane rip through her physical form. She asked the darkness the ultimate alchemical question. What are you here to show me? Without the friction of resistance, a profound biological mechanism engaged. The emotion, allowed to burn freely, quickly exhausted its chemical fuel. After 12 minutes of intense, unmitigated somatic fire, the shaking began to subside. The tight, iron band around her chest fractured. A deep, involuntary sigh escaped her lips, and oxygen rushed into the bottom of her lungs. Eleanor remained on the floor, but the room felt entirely different. The problem had not disappeared. The legal documents still lay on the rug, but the heavy, paralyzing density of the frequency had dissolved. By accepting the death of her organization completely, by feeling the terror without fighting it, she transmuted the heavy lead of panic into the clear gold of pure awareness. Operating from this clear, spacious frequency, solutions that were previously invisible began to slowly materialize in the quiet expanse of her mind. The true mastery of energetic frequency is widely misunderstood by the modern psyche. The objective is not to build an impenetrable fortress where the dark winds of fear, grief, and anger can never reach. Such a fortress is merely a beautifully decorated prison, requiring vast amounts of energy to guard and maintain. True high frequency is not the absence of darkness, it is the profound, unshakable capacity to remain anchored in the light while the darkness freely passes by. To embody this truth is to practice the art of opening both the front and back doors of the mind. When the heavy, dense storms of existence arrive, when the stinging criticism is delivered, when the financial loss occurs, when the unexpected diagnosis is spoken, the invitation is to drop the heavy armor of resistance. Do not brace for impact, become porous. Let the wind blow directly through the architecture of the house. Feel the physical sensation of the emotion in the chest, the throat, or the stomach, and observe it with the gentle, curious warmth of a scientist studying a fascinating chemical reaction. The emotion will burn, it will crest, and, deprived of the fuel of resistance, it will inevitably break and recede. Yet, mastering the cognitive release of resistance only addresses the surface layer of the human experience. The mind can learn to observe the storm, but the physical body is a dense, ancient sponge that has spent decades absorbing and storing the unexpressed traumas, suppressed terrors, and unwept tears of a lifetime. The tissues, the muscles, and the fascia carry the heavy, stagnant static of old, unfelt emotions. To truly clear the biological receiver, to elevate the physical organism so that it can hold the massive electrical charge of a higher consciousness, one must descend out of the mind entirely and enter the dense, visceral realm of the flesh. The bridge between the ethereal observer and the heavy, physical earth is hidden in plain sight, operating continuously, rhythmically, from the moment of birth to the moment of death. The key to unlocking the body's frozen history lies in the simple, overlooked mechanics of the next inhalation. Observe the microscopic, silent miracle occurring precisely at the threshold of the human body. The surrounding room is still, the temperature hovering in the crisp, neutral space between warm and cold. There is no grand external event demanding attention. All focus draws inward, zooming infinitesimally close to the delicate, porous membrane just inside the nostrils. A sudden rhythmic vacuum engages deep within the torso. The diaphragm, a thick, dome-shaped muscle resting beneath the lungs, contracts and pulls downward. This physical movement creates a drop in internal pressure, and the external atmosphere rushes in to fill the void. The air, carrying the faint, metallic chill of the room, grazes the sensitive nerve endings of the nasal cavity. It travels down the trachea, branching into a complex, sprawling biological forest of bronchi and bronchioles, until it finally arrives at the microscopic alveoli. Here, in these tiny balloon-like sacs, a breathtaking chemical exchange occurs in absolute silence. Oxygen dissolves through walls only a single cell thick, entering the bloodstream to feed the 86 billion neurons of the brain, while the heavy, toxic waste of carbon dioxide is expelled on the exhale. The human organism executes this process roughly 20,000 times a day, the vast majority of these cycles operating entirely in the dark, automated by the primitive brainstem. The mind races through the past and panics about the future, completely ignoring the rhythmic tide rising and falling in the chest. Yet, when conscious awareness is deliberately applied to this exact biological function, the breath ceases to be merely a mechanism of survival. It transforms into an energetic tether. It becomes the ultimate somatic bridge spanning the vast, terrifying gap between the ethereal, formless realm of the observer and the heavy, dense reality of physical matter. The mind is an untethered kite, prone to being violently thrown by the chaotic winds of the quantum field. The body is the heavy lead weight resting on the earth. The conscious breath is the unbreakable string connecting the two. When the observer drops their absolute attention directly into the physical sensation of the air entering and leaving the lungs, they pull their consciousness out of the abstract illusions of time and anchor it violently, beautifully, into the singular truth of the present moment. To understand the urgent necessity of this somatic bridge, a rigorous descent into the darkest, most neglected terrain of the human organism is required. The intellect is highly skilled at learning new spiritual concepts. It can easily memorize the maps of consciousness and articulate the theories of quantum physics. But the physical body does not speak the language of philosophy. The body speaks only the language of sensation, and it possesses a memory that is ancient, ruthless, and entirely unforgiving. Why does intellectual understanding so frequently fail to permanently elevate a person's frequency? The failure occurs because the cognitive mind is merely the sunlit surface of the ocean, while the physical body constitutes the dark, pressurized, unfathomable trenches below. Throughout a human lifetime, whenever the ego erects a dam of resistance against a terrifying emotion, whenever a grief is swallowed, an anger is suppressed, or a panic is forcefully hidden behind a professional smile, the kinetic energy does not vanish. It is forcefully pushed down into the subterranean layers of the biology. How does the body store this invisible weight? It stores it physically in the musculature, the organs, and the vast, web-like network of the fascia. Unfelt emotions literally crystallize into trapped density. The nervous system absorbs the unexpressed electrical charge and locks it in place. The jaw remains chronically clenched. The psoas muscle in the pelvis tightens in a permanent posture of defense. The shoulders curve forward, shielding the heart from an attack that ended 2 decades ago. The human being becomes a walking, biological graveyard of frozen trauma. They attempt to broadcast a frequency of abundance and peace into the quantum field, but their cellular structure is silently screaming a frequency of terror, vibrating like a rusted engine threatening to tear itself apart. To clear this trapped static, the intellect is useless. One cannot think a tight muscle into true relaxation. The dense, tangled forest of the fascia requires a different key. It requires the penetrating, alchemical fire of conscious presence, delivered through the vehicle of the breath. When the observer takes a slow, intentional breath and directs that oxygen not just into the lungs, but imaginatively into the tight, aching center of the chest or the knotted pit of the stomach, an extraordinary biological signal is sent. The slow, rhythmic expansion of the diaphragm physically massages the vagus nerve. This massive nerve bundle instantly transmits a message to the hypervigilant amygdala. The environment is safe. The war is over. Under the warm, relentless spotlight of this conscious breathing, the crystallized density begins to melt. The trapped electrical charges, frozen for years in the cellular memory, finally thaw, returning to liquid energy, ready to be washed out of the organism on the next exhale. To witness the profound power of this somatic key, observe the quiet crucible of a man named Marcus, seated in the sterile, aggressively brightly lit waiting area of a neurologist's office. For 3 weeks, Marcus had been experiencing inexplicable physical symptoms, a numbness radiating down his left arm, accompanied by severe, blinding migraines. In his hands, he held a sealed envelope containing the results of a comprehensive MRI. The environment was a masterpiece of clinical anxiety. The faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, maddening electrical hum. As Marcus stared at the white envelope, the biological storm struck with devastating force. The descent into the lower frequencies was nearly instantaneous. His heart rate spiked to 140 beats per minute. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. Deep within his solar plexus, a knot of pure, unadulterated terror formed, and feeling as dense and heavy as a sphere of solid lead. The automated neural pathways fired, screaming a narrative of absolute doom. This is the end. The worst possible outcome is inside this envelope. A year prior, Marcus would have been entirely consumed by this wave. He would have dissociated, frantically scrolling on his phone, shallowly panting from the top of his chest, locking the terror deep into his fascia to avoid feeling it. The energy would have calcified, dropping his frequency into the darkest trenches of apathy and fear. But Marcus had been practicing the architecture of the bridge. He did not open the envelope. He closed his eyes, cutting off the harsh visual data of the clinic. He abandoned the chaotic, swirling storm of his thoughts and forcefully dropped his entire center of awareness down into his body. He located the sensation, the heavy, burning lead sphere of terror in his stomach. He did not try to make it go away. He did not recite hollow affirmations of health. Instead, he deployed the breath as a surgical instrument. Marcus drew in a massive, slow inhalation through his nose, taking a full 5 seconds to fill his lungs. As he breathed, he directed the entirety of his conscious presence straight into the center of the heavy knot in his solar plexus. He wrapped his awareness around the physical sensation of the terror. Here is the fear, the silent observer noted. It is dense. It is hot. It is welcome. He held the breath for 3 seconds, allowing the oxygen to physically press against the boundaries of the tension. And then, he released it with a slow, controlled exhale through slightly parted lips. He repeated this cycle. On the 4th conscious breath, the vagus nerve finally overrode the panicked signals of the amygdala. A physical shudder moved through Marcus's spine. The dense, lead sphere of terror in his stomach suddenly fractured. The intense heat of the emotion broke apart, washing through his torso like a wave of warm water, tingling down his arms and legs, and dissipating into the air around him. The fear had been allowed to complete its thermodynamic cycle. It had moved, burned, and exited. Marcus opened his eyes. The fluorescent light still hummed, the envelope was still in his hand, but the heavy, paralyzing density had evaporated. He was anchored, clear, and vibrating at the elevated frequency of absolute presence. With a steady hand, he slid his finger under the seal. The mastery of this biological instrument reveals a breathtaking reality. The individual is never more than a single breath away from profound internal realignment. The tangled forest of the nervous system, no matter how deeply overgrown with the thorns of past trauma, can always be cleared with the persistent, gentle blade of conscious respiration. Every moment of the day presents a silent, invisible intersection. The nervous system will constantly encounter the friction of existence, triggering the ancient urge to contract, to brace, and to hold the breath. In every one of those moments, the observer holds the absolute power to intervene, choosing to drop the anchor of the breath into the deep ocean of the body, allowing the friction to wash through without leaving a permanent scar. For a consciousness to reach this level of mastery, to continually choose the difficult path of feeling over the easy path of numbing, requires immense, quiet bravery. If this exploration of the somatic bridge resonates deeply in the architecture of the chest, if the mechanics of the invisible current are finally providing the clarity long sought after, consider leaving a mark of that recognition here. Pressing the like button, subscribing to this channel, and sharing a reflection in the comments is more than digital engagement. It is a conscious declaration of alignment. It signals a readiness to participate in a community dedicated to pulling back the veil on human potential, demanding truth over comfort. Joining this space ensures that as the exploration of these profound mechanics deepens, the connection remains unbroken. The journey requires fellow travelers willing to walk with their eyes completely open. As the physical body is meticulously cleared of its heavy, stagnant static through the alchemy of the breath, the organism becomes highly conductive. It is no longer a rusted, clogged machine, but a finely tuned, crystalline receiver. Operating without the internal density of fear, the observer steps back into the external world. and the external world, bound by the strict mathematical laws of quantum resonance, has absolutely no choice but to completely reorganize itself around this new, luminous vibration. The horizon is no longer a distant, hostile frontier. It is a canvas waiting for the brush to fall. The final paradigm approaches. The air in the room possesses a breathtaking, weightless clarity. It is the soft, golden hour just after dawn, a time when the ambient light does not merely illuminate the space, but seems to actively warm the grain of the floorboards and the fibers of the bedsheets. The sharp, mechanical rhythm of the ticking wall clock, once a relentless hammer against a hyper-vigilant nervous system, is now just a quiet, rhythmic hum, blending seamlessly into the distant, a gentle rustle of leaves outside the window. A figure sits at the edge of the mattress, but the posture is radically altered. The shoulders are drawn back, the chest is open, and the spine rests in an effortless, stacked alignment. The alarm has sounded, yet the nervous system remains entirely undisturbed, resting in a deep, somatic stillness. For this individual, the simple act of existing no longer requires calculated force. The heavy armor forged in the tangled forest of survival programming has been permanently discarded on the floor. Every movement through the morning routine is laced with an eerie, frictionless grace. The water from the faucet feels vital and cleansing. The fabric of the clothing rests softly against the skin. The act of walking out the front door is not a march into a hostile battlefield, but a quiet step into an ocean of infinite potential. They step out into a crowded, damp street, their mind entirely devoid of the frantic, defensive calculations that once consumed their energy. The world presents itself not as an obstacle course of closed doors, but as a fluid, deeply responsive canvas. The dense, chaotic energy of the morning commute parts around them. When a sudden rain shower begins, their jaw does not clench, they merely appreciate the shift in the atmospheric pressure. When a stranger bumps their shoulder, the reaction is not a spike of cortisol and a defensive posture, but a genuine, easy smile that instantly diffuses the stranger's own frantic rush. They are no longer pushing reality, they are being carried by it. The locked doors swing open before the hand even reaches the brass handle. The struggle, the exhausting friction of attempting to force the universe into submission, has completely evaporated. The invisible current has caught them, and the horizon is vast, clear, and breathtakingly open. Faced with this sudden, seemingly miraculous dissolution of daily friction, the analytical mind must pause and rigorously deconstruct the mechanics of this newly reorganized reality. Why does the physical environment suddenly stop resisting the individual? And how does a lifetime of agonizing struggle vanish without a single change to the external laws of physics? The answer requires abandoning the deeply ingrained illusion of separation. For decades, the ego operated under the terrified assumption that it was a fragile, localized biological object surrounded by a vast, indifferent universe of other heavy, solid objects. From that perspective of absolute separation, survival required constant manipulation, defense, and friction. Reality was a concrete wall that had to be battered down with sheer force. But when the frequency is elevated, when the dense, the trapped static is cleared from the fascia and the neural superhighways of fear are starved of their electrical charge, the perceptual lens fundamentally shifts. The organism no longer perceives solid matter, it perceives the quantum field. How does this interaction work in practice? It operates through the law of energetic resonance. The human brain, now quieted, acts as a highly tuned, crystalline receiver. The amygdala is silent. The prefrontal cortex is flooded with oxygen and blood flow. The heart and the brain enter a state of measurable, biological coherence, emitting an electromagnetic field that is orderly, expansive, and highly conductive. Because the individual is no longer broadcasting the dense, chaotic static of fear or the desperate, grasping frequency of lack, the surrounding quantum field has nothing to resist. The universe is essentially a mirror reflecting the observer's biological frequency. When the observer approaches the mirror with a raised fist, the mirror reflects a fist, and the resulting collision causes immense suffering. When the observer drops the fist and approaches the mirror with a quiet, open hand, the The reflection instantly matches the gesture. The physical world did not suddenly become kinder. It simply obeyed the mathematical laws of quantum resonance. The individual is no longer reacting to a solid, unforgiving world. They are actively, continuously conversing with a living, breathing matrix of potential that rearranges its subatomic structure to match the exact coordinate of their consciousness. To witness this reorganized reality in motion, observe a woman named Sarah entering an environment designed to trigger maximum biological panic. Sarah was an independent producer, walking into a high-stakes, aggressively contested negotiation in a sprawling, glass-paneled corporate boardroom. Her task was to secure the rights to a project from a massive conglomerate renowned for its hostile, predatory tactics. 2 years prior, Sarah would have approached this room entirely clad in psychological armor. Her nervous system would have been vibrating at the frequency of sheer terror, heavily masked by a profound, rigid anger. She would have viewed the opposing executives as lethal predators, and her biology would have flooded her bloodstream with cortisol. In that dense state, she would have argued forcefully, pushed against their resistance, and likely watched the deal shatter under the weight of mutual friction. Today, however, Sarah walked through the heavy glass doors carrying no armor whatsoever. She took a seat at the long mahogany table. Across from her sat 3 executives, their posture rigid, their faces locked in expressions of clinical dominance. The room was heavy with the dense, oppressive air of a battlefield. The lead executive began the meeting with a sharp, intentionally aggressive demand, designed specifically to trigger a defensive response, to throw Sarah off balance, and force her into a reactive, low-frequency state. The words hung in the sterile air, sharp as shattered glass. Sarah felt the microscopic, biological urge to react, a faint ghost of the old neural pathway attempting to fire. But she deployed the somatic bridge. She took a slow, imperceptible breath, dropping her awareness out of the frantic chatter of the mind and into the quiet depth of her abdomen. She held her frequency firmly in the stratosphere of the observer. She did not fuse with the aggression in the room, she simply watched it. She looked at the lead executive, not as a predator, but as a biological organism trapped in a lower dimension of fear and scarcity. Operating from this elevated vantage point, she did not defend herself. She did not raise her voice. She offered a warm, empathetic smile and spoke softly, addressing a peripheral, entirely unexpected creative angle of the project that bypassed the financial demand completely. Because Sarah did not push back, the executives had absolutely no friction to push against. Their aggression, meeting a space of total energetic acceptance, simply collapsed. It was like watching a heavy stone thrown into a deep, calm ocean. There was a small splash, and then the water immediately swallowed the stone, returning to perfect, glassy stillness. Within 20 minutes, the entire atmosphere of the boardroom had fundamentally altered. The executives, consciously in training to Sarah's highly coherent, dominant electromagnetic frequency, relaxed their shoulders. The dense, hostile energy evaporated. Solutions that were previously obscured by the thick fog of corporate warfare suddenly became glaringly obvious to everyone at the table. The deal was finalized with an ease that defied all logical, Newtonian business models. Sarah walked out of the glass-paneled room not as a conqueror who had won a bloody war, but as an architect who had simply commanded the field to reorganize. The realization that the external world is entirely malleable, bending to the silent, biological frequency of the observer, strips away the final remnants of victimhood. It leaves the human psyche standing on the edge of a breathtaking precipice. The heavy, mechanical paradigm of a fixed universe, a world of gatekeepers, permanent obstacles, and rigid destinies has been entirely dismantled. What remains is a sprawling, infinite ocean of potential, waiting patiently for a conscious hand to shape the waters. The journey through the dense, tangled underbrush of the human condition is complete. But it is not an ending. It is a profound beginning. The maps of consciousness have been charted. The illusions of the quantum hologram have been pierced. The deeply grooved neural superhighways of the past have been pruned and rewired. The heavy, trapped density of the physical body has been exhaled, leaving behind a clear, crystalline receiver perfectly tuned to the higher dimensions of reality. To step away from this exploration and return to the physical world is to walk into a completely new paradigm of existence. The task for today, and for all the days that follow, is singular and clear. When the morning light breaks, do not rush to conquer the external environment. Do not exhaust the biology by attempting to force the universe into compliance. Instead, sit quietly in the stillness. Tune the internal receiver. Clear the breath. Find the silent, untouchable space of the observer, and anchor the nervous system in the expansive frequency of courage and acceptance. When the internal coordinate is set, simply stand up and walk into the day. Watch how the dense matter of the world softens. Watch how the locked doors unlock. Watch how the serendipitous encounters arrive with mathematical precision. The invisible current is real, it is powerful, and it is flowing continuously beneath the surface of the ordinary world. The struggle is over. The friction has dissolved. Step forward, release the resistance, and let the current carry the life it was always meant to build.